Good evening and welcome to this evening's debate. We're going to be discussing today the crucifixion of Jesus. Did Jesus die by crucifixion? Today we have two debaters with us. On my right we have Ehteshaam Gulam. He runs the website answeringchristianclaims.com, and he's also a student at Eastern Michigan University, currently studying business. He's writing his first book right now, From Christianity to Islam, The Truth You Need to Know, which will be published by a division of Random House. On my left side today, we have Dr. David Wood. He is a professor in philosophy. He teaches philosophy at Fordham University. He runs the website answeringmuslims.com and is part of a two-person apologetics ministry, act17.net. My name is Nabil Qureshi, and I'll be moderating tonight's debate. The topic that we're discussing today is very crucial to both Islam and Christianity. Christianity has claimed since its inception that Jesus did in fact die by crucifixion, and it is from his death by crucifixion that he then rose on Easter. If Jesus did not die on the cross, then Christianity is in vain. On the other hand, in Islam, we have the teaching that Jesus did not die by crucifixion, nor was he crucified, and we're going to be hearing the discussion about that tonight. If Jesus did die by crucifixion, then in fact we have a clear contradiction against what is stated explicitly in the Quran, the Muslim holy book. So today we'll be discussing these topics, and both sides will provide very intriguing, exciting defense of what they have to say. One thing I would like to say before we start is this is in fact a debate which is very different from interfaith dialogue. We're going to be hearing both sides really analyze what the other person is saying, and they're not going to be hesitant to say when they think the other person is wrong. So often what we see in debates is a very straightforward declaration that the other person is wrong on various accounts, and that's just the way the debate works. That's the way it happens. So don't be expecting an interfaith picnic. I'm looking forward to seeing what these guys have to say, and said very vitally. We're going to start off today with a 20-minute opening statement by David Wood. David?
Good evening. I'd like to thank the Center for Religious Debate for arranging this event. Jesus' death by crucifixion, as Nabil pointed out, is foundational to Christianity, and it's always a privilege to be able to present a case for one of our core doctrines. I'd also like to thank Ehteshaam for agreeing to defend the Muslim position. I can't say I want to be in his shoes, given the overwhelming evidence against him, but I certainly respect his willingness to stand up and defend what he believes. Christians and Muslims agree on a number of issues. We agree that there is one God, all-powerful, all-knowing, infinite, holy, and good. We agree that God has sent messengers into the world, and that people like Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David were mighty prophets. Concerning Jesus, we agree that he was born of a virgin, that he performed miracles, and that he is the Messiah. But we do have disagreements on some fundamental doctrines: the status of Muhammad and the Quran, the nature of God, whether he is triune, the reliability of the New Testament, and of course Jesus' death, resurrection, and deity. These areas of disagreement are extremely important for people who seek the truth, because if Christianity claims one thing and Islam claims something else, and we can somehow investigate the issue to see where the evidence points, then even with all our flaws and limitations, we can know what the true religion is. Careful study of Jesus' death by crucifixion is perfect for this task. Islam teaches that Jesus never died and that he wasn't even crucified. In Surah 4:157 we read, "They said in boast, 'We killed Christ Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah. But they killed him not, nor crucified him, but so it was made to appear to them.'" So according to the Quran, Jesus' crucifixion was some kind of illusion. Christianity, on the other hand, teaches that Jesus died on the cross, and this is the unanimous testimony of the early church. Now, here's the key. Both religions are making claims that can be investigated historically, which means that what we believe about Jesus' crucifixion isn't simply a matter of blind faith. History allows us to examine the evidence and to determine which view, the Christian view or the Muslim view, is supported by the facts. In this debate, I'm going to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Jesus died by crucifixion. In order to establish my case, I'll show, first, that all of our reliable historical sources confirm Jesus' death. Second, that our knowledge of Roman crucifixion practices makes it clear that surviving the cross was impossible. Third, that virtually all historical Jesus scholars and New Testament scholars agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. And finally, that Muslim attempts to explain away the evidence fail, and I would say fail miserably. But before we turn to the historical data, I'd like to begin with an Old Testament prophecy. In Isaiah 53, the prophet Isaiah tells us about someone who would die for our sins and rise from the dead. In verses 5 through 8, Isaiah says this: "He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken." Isaiah spoke these words approximately 700 years before Jesus walked the earth. But since Jesus is really the only person in history who fits Isaiah's description, I'd say we have evidence from the Old Testament that Jesus would die for our sins. Muslims, of course, don't believe this prophecy refers to Jesus, since they don't believe Jesus died. But the historical evidence leaves no room for rational doubt on this point. Let's consider some of the ancient sources that scholars take into account when they investigate the execution of Jesus. All four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, report the crucifixion, and these are all first-century sources. I would put the Gospel of Mark in the 50s at the latest, and some scholars date the pre-Markan Passion narrative to within 7 years of Jesus' death. The other Gospels are later, but it's important to keep in mind that all of the Gospels were written within the lifetimes of eyewitnesses. Apart from the Gospels, other writers of the New Testament confirm Jesus' crucifixion and death, including Paul, Peter, and the author of Hebrews. We also know some ancient Christian creeds that predate the writing of any of the New Testament books. The most important early creed is recorded in 1 Corinthians 15. Even non-Christian scholars date this creed to within 5 years of Jesus' death. So this is extremely early material. And some scholars date it even earlier. Marcus Borg, the Jesus Seminar, for instance, says that this creed was composed within months of Jesus' death. So this is, again, very early material. What does this early record say? It says, quote, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. This was the official teaching of the earliest church. This was the official teaching of Jesus' disciples. But suppose we want to be very critical of the New Testament and even of the early creeds that predate the writing of the books of the New Testament. Here we can turn to the second generation of Christian leaders, which included people like Papias, Ignatius, Clement of Rome, and Polycarp. We have writings and quotations from these men, and this is important because some of them knew the apostles. Polycarp, for instance, was a disciple of the Apostle John. So what do we find when we turn to these writings and quotations? All we ever find is confirmation of the New Testament position that Jesus died on the cross. But even if we decide to throw out all Christian testimony, we still have to conclude that Jesus died by crucifixion because we can establish Jesus' death using non-Christian sources. We know that the first century historian Thallus was aware of Jesus' execution because in 52 AD, around 20 years after the event, Thallus tried to explain the darkness that covered the land during Jesus' execution. Later in the first century, the Jewish historian Josephus also reports that Jesus died under the reign of Pontius Pilate. The Roman historian Tacitus, a little later, in book 15 of his Annals, also reports that Jesus died by crucifixion under the reign of Pontius Pilate. We could go on to other sources, Marvar Serapi, the Jewish Samosata, the Jewish Talmud, the writings of heretical groups, and so on. But it should be clear by now that we have a ton of ancient texts telling us that Jesus died by crucifixion. And I challenge Ehteshaam to produce a first century source that says otherwise. So our earliest sources, Christian sources, Jewish sources, and Roman sources, unanimously support the Christian view. But things get worse for Muslim apologists because when we combine our historical knowledge of Roman crucifixion with modern medical knowledge, any theory suggesting Jesus didn't die start to sound ridiculous. Prior to crucifixion, the Romans would scourge their victims with a flagrum, which was made of leather thongs with chunks of bone or metal woven into the strands. We know historically what a flagrum would do to a person. We have ancient reports of people being beaten until their veins and arteries were exposed. This writes about people being flogged until their bones were showing or until their intestines spilled out. The first century philosopher Seneca describes victims of crucifixion as battered, misshapen, and deformed, due in large part to the beating they received. The flogging was sometimes called the half-death, because by the time the Romans finished, victims were half dead. After the scourging came the crucifixion. Depending on the severity of the scourging and on how long the Romans wanted to keep a victim on the cross, death could sometimes take up to a few days. But if they were in a rush, they had ways of speeding up the process. They could give a more severe beating, or just break the victim's legs so that he couldn't push himself up to breathe. You see, after hanging for a while in a crucified position, you can try this on some monkey bars or something. After hanging a while with your arms stretched out in that position, breathing starts to become extremely difficult. Your lungs fill up with oxygen, but you can't exhale. So in order to catch your breath, victims would have to push themselves up on their feet, which have been pierced with a giant nail. But eventually, your leg muscles would give out. And they've done studies on this. People tend to last 10 minutes at the beginning. You can hold yourself up for about 10 minutes, and that decreases with each time you push yourself up. So you have to keep repeating this process. Push up on your feet until your legs give out, and then drop back down until your oxygen runs out. Up and down, up and down. Some people kept this up for days. But eventually you would pass out. And once you've gone 20 or 30 minutes without pushing yourself up to breathe, people know that you're dead. But the Romans did take crucifixion lightly. So even after they were convinced that their victims were dead, they would add a death blow, just in case. They would smash a victim's head in, or stab him through the heart with a sword or a spear, or set him on fire, or let wild animals rip him apart. The type of death blow was up to the officer on duty, but they always had a way of making sure that the victim was dead. Now, when we consider the Roman practices of scourging, crucifixion, and the death blow, we can see why a research team writing for the Journal of the American Medical Association concluded their article by saying that, quote, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. There's simply no way Jesus could have come down from the cross alive. Given the evidence, it should come as no surprise that there's a consensus among scholars that Jesus died on the cross. Recently, Dr. Gary Habermas, one of the world's leading authorities on the historical evidence for Jesus' death and resurrection, completed a study of more than 2,700 sources on this issue. He added up the data and found that there are certain facts that practically all scholars agree on. And Jesus' death by crucifixion is at the top of this list. Conservative Christian scholars, liberal Christian scholars, Jewish scholars, even atheist and agnostic scholars agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. Let's look briefly at what some non-Christian scholars, non-Christians here, have to say on the topic of this debate. Atheist New Testament scholar Gev Ludeman declares that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Dominic Crossan of the notoriously liberal Jesus Seminar says that there is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. According to Crossan, that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Marcus Lord states that Jesus' execution is the most certain fact about the historical Jesus. Jewish scholar Giza Vermi says that the passion of Jesus is part of history. The passion is the series of events leading up to and including Jesus' death by crucifixion. Another Jewish scholar, Pinchas Lapid, concludes that Jesus' death by crucifixion is historically certain. According to Paul Fredrickson, the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. And since so many Muslims are becoming fans of Bart Ehrman, we can't leave out Ehrman's view. Ehrman says this: one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Non-Christian scholars tend to be extremely biased when they discuss Christianity. So it's significant that on this issue, Jesus' crucifixion and death, even anti-Christian scholars agree with the Christian position. And not only do they agree with us, they say that Jesus' death by crucifixion is indisputable, that it's historically certain, that it's one of the most certain facts in all of history. Whenever people of diverse theological backgrounds agree on something about the historical Jesus, there has to be a good reason for it. In this case, the answer is clear. That Jesus died on the cross is the only explanation that makes sense of the evidence. And yet, Muslims have somehow convinced themselves that Jesus didn't die on the cross, all because of Surah 4:157, a verse delivered nearly 6 centuries after Jesus' death, in a language Jesus never spoke, in a country Jesus never entered, by a man who couldn't offer any good evidence that he was a prophet of God. But if Jesus didn't die, what happened? Well, according to the traditional Muslim position, Jesus went around telling people to believe in the Torah. For some strange reason, this upset the Jews so much that they decided to kill him. But God took Jesus out of this world into heaven. Then God disguised Judas to make him look like Jesus. So it was Judas who was crucified, but God made everyone think that it was Jesus. This is called substitution theory, the view that Jesus was replaced on the cross by a substitute. On this view, the reason we have so much historical evidence for Jesus' death is that God did an outstanding job tricking everyone. My question for Ehteshaam is why? Why did God trick everyone? Islam has a problem here because according to the Quran, Jesus' followers were good Muslims. But we know from history that Jesus' original followers came to believe that he died on the cross for their sins. So where did they get this idea? If the Muslim explanation is correct, they apparently got this false view from God, who ultimately deceived everyone into believing that Jesus died on the cross. Now, explanations like this are hard to accept. If you're not a Muslim and you don't believe that God can go around tricking people for no reason and starting false religions in the process. But Muslims are really forced into making these sorts of claims because Muhammad said things that just don't make sense in light of the evidence. History is a huge problem for Islam. Interestingly, many Muslims now recognize how bizarre it is to say that Jesus wasn't crucified, despite the fact that the Quran declares quite plainly that Jesus wasn't crucified. And so Muslim apologists like Shabir Ali now claim that Jesus was crucified, but that he survived crucifixion. According to this view, God miraculously sustained Jesus' life while he was on the cross. So when Jesus was being beaten until the flesh on his back was hanging like ribbons, and punched in the face repeatedly and nailed to the cross and pierced by a spear, God made sure he survived all of it. Jesus eventually passed out, but a little later he woke up in the tomb. Unfortunately, he forgot to tell his followers that he didn't die, and without this crucial piece of information, they concluded that he had risen from the dead. Then they went to their horribly bloody deaths, proclaiming Jesus' resurrection, all because God, once again, had tricked everyone into thinking that Jesus died, and because Jesus failed to tell the disciples that he survived crucifixion. It should be clear already that these Muslim explanations raise more problems than they attempt to solve. Appealing to God as some kind of cosmic trickster just isn't a satisfying response. If you're willing to go that far to avoid the evidence, you could explain away anything. You all think you're watching me debate right now? What if I told you I'm not really here? God took me to heaven. Then he disguised Ehteshaam to make him look like me. Well, who's that over there? Well, God disguised someone else, and what sense does this make? Absolutely none whatsoever. But again, Muslims have to resort to explanations like this. They have to resort, I'd say, to blasphemy in order to rescue Muhammad's teachings. I think this tells us something about Muhammad's teachings. Now, what evidence can Muslims possibly offer in support of such strange claims? Well, some Muslim apologists, such as the late Ahmed Didat, appeal to the Gospel of Barnabas as evidence. But if Muslims would do 10 minutes of research, they find that the Gospel of Barnabas was written more than 1,000 years after Jesus' death, in Italian, a language that didn't even exist in the first century. There isn't a scholar anywhere in our galaxy who believes that the Gospel of Barnabas is authentic. But Muslims continue to use it because they don't have any real evidence. It's also becoming increasingly popular for Muslims to cite Gnostic and Docetist texts from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries to support their view. A couple of these texts declare that Jesus never died, and Muslims say, there you go. Ancient books saying that Jesus never died. This shows that Muhammad's view is correct. But this claim is based on sheer deception. The Gnostics and the Docetists who wrote these books were heretics who believed that Jesus was so divine, he didn't actually have human flesh, and therefore couldn't have really been crucified. So according to these texts, Jesus wasn't even a human being. He was only a God. Now, I ask you, how in the name of common sense can Muslims point to books They say Jesus wasn't even human as support for Islam. It simply makes no sense. But again, if you have no evidence, this is what you have to do. Amazingly, the most common approach among Muslim apologists today is to go to the New Testament to defend Islam. And I find this absolutely shocking. The New Testament declares over and over and over again, like a beating drum, that Jesus died by crucifixion. The Gospels proclaim repeatedly that Jesus died by crucifixion. So it's astounding to see Muslim apologists in an act of total desperation, ripping verses out of context, violating every fundamental rule of scriptural interpretation, twisting and mangling the obvious meaning of basic passages, all because they don't have a shred of evidence for their own position. Let me be clear here. Going to the New Testament to support the claim that Jesus didn't die would be like me going to the Quran to support the claim that God is Trinity. Could I do it? Of course I could. In the Quran, God refers to himself with the pronoun we. There you have it. We, that refers to the Trinity, case closed. But I'm not that desperate. Muslims are, and so I fully expect Ehteshaam to spend a great deal of time pointing to texts such as the sign of Jonah and other New Testament passages, showing us that these texts prove that Jesus never died. We'll see what he comes up with. To sum up, we have two hypotheses before us, the Christian hypothesis and the Muslim hypothesis. According to the Christian hypothesis, Jesus died by crucifixion. Our view is supported by 1, Old Testament prophecy, 2, all the early historical sources, 3, all our knowledge of Roman crucifixion practices, and 4, a consensus among scholars. According to the Muslim hypothesis, Jesus wasn't killed, and he may or may not have been crucified depending on how seriously you take the Quran. This view is supported by nothing. There are tons of problems with it, and Muslims can only defend it by appealing to obvious forgeries like the Gospel of Barnabas, or by cherry-picking verses from the New Testament. So which hypothesis should we accept? Should we accept a hypothesis supported by prophecy, historical proof, and a scholarly consensus? Or should we accept a hypothesis supported by no evidence, one that portrays God as a deceiver and Jesus as a miserable failure? Even to ask the question is to answer it. Jesus died, my friends. To deny this is to display an utter bias against history, logic, evidence, reason, and revelation.
Thank you, David. And now we're going to move to the Muslim opening statement by Ehteshaam Gulam. Ehteshaam, are you ready?
Hello. I hope everyone is well today. I just want to say this is a very beautiful church. I haven't been to many churches in the past, but this is a very nice church. I just want to thank Mr. Wood for agreeing to do this debate. We had quite a kind of an issue in our email exchanges, and we got through those issues. So I really appreciate that. Today's topic is, was Christ really crucified, or did Jesus really die by crucifixion? I feel this is an important topic for both Muslims and Christians seeking the truth for the matter, since both Islam and Christianity have different things to say about this topic. Islam says that Jesus was a human being, a messenger from God, and I believe that's more historically accurate than the Christian view that says Jesus was the Son of God, or God, or one part of the Trinity, because all historians believe that Jesus was a human being, a Jewish rabbi, etc. So there is more historical evidence for the Islamic claim that Jesus was a human, a prophet, a messenger from God, than the Christian view that says Jesus was the Son of God. He's one in three. No historian will ever say that Jesus is the Son of God or he's divine in any way. Though at most these atheist scholars, etc., will say, well, Jesus was a human being. We have all historical evidence that agrees with the Islamic point that Jesus was a human being and not the Son of God or divine in any way. One of my major points is the Quran does not say that somebody else was put on the cross instead of Jesus. And I'll read the Quranic view. The Quran, for those who aren't familiar with the Quran's like a holy book for Muslims. It's like God's love letter to humanity, which was revealed to the final messenger of God, Muhammad, peace be upon him. Anyways, the Quran says that they said in boast, we killed Christ Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah. But they did not kill him, nor crucify him, but it was made to appear to them. And those who differ therein are full of doubt, with no certain knowledge, but only conjecture to follow, for surely they killed him not. Quran chapter 4, verse 157. Nowhere here does it say that somebody else was put on the cross. Rather, it says it was made to appear to them. For ages, Muslims have came up with two theories. One, that Jesus was never even nailed on the cross. And two, that Jesus was nailed to the cross, but he did not die on the cross. And I agree with Mr. Wood when he says that the substitution theory is ridiculous, because it is ridiculous. It's like saying, well, God could have deceived everybody, and that's not what the Quran says. The Arabic words found in the Quran are salabuhu, which was translated by many as he was not crucified. In the Arabic word lakin sabalakum, the meaning of salabakum is given in the Arabic dictionary as a likeness. The word Sahiya is a passive form for the root word, which means to make look like. So the original Arabic of the Quran does not support the substitution theory, that somebody else was put on the cross instead of Jesus. Rather, what the Quran is saying, what I understand the Quran is saying, is that Jesus did not die on the cross. Rather, it just looked like he did. And there's tons of good evidence for that. And the Gospel of Barnabas is a medieval forgery. I do agree with Christian critics when they bring that up. Muslims should seriously stop using it. First of all, let's talk about the resurrection and why the resurrection was not a physical resurrection, but a spiritual resurrection. Paul, the earliest Christian writer, he was writing before the four Gospels were written, portrays the resurrection into a spiritual body, not the rising of a corpse. He says, the body you sow is not the body that will rise. 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 15, verse 37. So Paul says that when somebody is resurrected, they're given a new body, one not made of flesh or physical matter, as we know, but some kind of spiritual and ethereal matter, material, same as the angels. Paul insists in 1 Galatians that he wasn't taught the gospel by anyone in the flesh, but by a revelation from God. He says, I did not receive it from a man, nor was I taught it, but through the revelation of Jesus the Messiah. We can't really take the alleged physical resurrection of Jesus to be historical at all. Paul never mentions Jesus having been resurrected in the flesh. He never mentions any empty tombs, no physical appearances, or the ascension of Jesus into heaven afterwards. Even 1 Peter doesn't mention any empty tombs or a physical resurrection of Jesus. Rather, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18 says Jesus was put to death on the cross, was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. And Paul clearly says that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, because flesh and blood is a mortal, perishable body, and we are resurrected as an imperishable body. It is thus plain that he does not believe that the resurrection involved flesh and blood, a physical body in a familiar sense, but a different, ethereal, spiritual body, the same sort angels have. And Jesus said the same thing, that when we're resurrected, our bodies are angelized, spiritualized, and not physical. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verse 25, Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verse 30, and Gospel of Luke, chapter 20, verse 34 to 36. So according to both Paul, the earliest Christian writer, and Jesus, resurrected bodies are spiritualized. 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 15, verse 37 through 50, and Luke, chapter 20, verse 34 through 36. Now, one of the main reasons why I'm not a Christian is because there's no evidence that Jesus was physically resurrected. Paul was clearly preaching some kind of spiritual resurrection. And it gets worse for the Christians because Paul, or Christian apologists, when they try to point to Paul, because Paul never met a historical Jesus. I find this odd that most of his books made it into the New Testament, yet this man never met the historical Jesus. He was never one of the close disciples of Jesus. Paul never quotes or mentions any of the Gospels, so it is clear that none of them were written during his time. He even denies he met Jesus, a physical Jesus, in Galatians 1. And the book of Acts gives us several accounts that this event is clearly reflected not on the traditions of a physical encounter, but a startling vision. I'm sorry. Sorry, no problem. Make sure you
And about these 500 witnesses, I mean, who are these 500 people that Paul is saying? Who are these 500 people? We have no way of knowing that what Paul is saying is true. So Paul is clearly teaching that when we're resurrected, it's not the same body. We're given a new spiritual body. There's lots of good evidence that Paul did not believe in the resurrection of a corpse. It was something fundamentally different, a spiritual body. Now let's move on. Now going to the crucifixion. Now we've heard about the spiritual or the resurrection involving the spiritual corpse. Now going to the crucifixion of Jesus, we have no way of really knowing that Jesus died on the cross. We can't travel back in time with the medical machinery and team of doctors necessary to clarify it. There is abundance of evidence, which I believe throws suspicion on the claim that he did, that Jesus died on the cross. In order for Jesus to have died, his heart must have been laid still and quiet for up to half an hour. His brain had to have starved for the lack of oxygen, with the whole network of neurons largely disintegrated, dissolved from massive cell death and pooling of acid bloods. Gases and fluids had to pool into his extremities and body cavities with rigor mortis setting in and coming in as goes. His body had to begin to rot. Anything less than this cannot be considered death. If his heart kept beating, perhaps one can argue that it was in a defiance of nature that it did, and perhaps one can extend this argument to the brain, not to the decay of the corpse, or every aspect of death. After years of studying this topic, I now believe Jesus survived his crucifixion. I don't believe that somebody else was put on the cross, because that's more naturalistic and possible than him dying and being physically resurrected the third day. And keep in mind that the earliest Christians believed in spiritual resurrection and not a physical resurrection. So getting to the crucifixion, in the gospel accounts, no one sees Jesus rise from the dead. When Jesus comes from the upper room after the alleged crucifixion, he said, "Shalom, peace be upon you." And he asks the disciples if they have any food for him to eat. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 36. In the next verse, Luke chapter 24, verse 37, the disciples were terrified and frightened because they thought Jesus was a spirit. Now, why would the disciples think that he was a spirit? The reason why is because they heard from hearsay that Jesus was put on the cross. They had learned from hearsay that he had given up the ghost, that he died. They had learned that Jesus was dead and put on the grave for 3 days. You know why? Because none of the disciples were actually eyewitnesses to the crucifixion. According to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verse 50, it says all the disciples ran away from Jesus when he was arrested to be crucified. So all the disciples in Jesus' most critical moment of Jesus' life, they all ran away from him. So they're not eyewitnesses to the event. But Jesus says he is not a spirit. Jesus is saying he's not resurrected. He's not a spirit. He's a physical person standing right before them. He says, "Behold my hands and feet. Handle me and see, for a spirit has no flesh and bones." In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 39 to 40. So Jesus was trying to prove that he was not spiritualized, that he was not resurrected. Jesus then eats the broiled fish and honeycomb, and the disciples give him in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 42 to 43. Now, I find this interesting when I'm reading the Gospels that Mary goes to the tomb of Jesus in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 1, and Mark, chapter 16, verse 2. Why would Mary go to the tomb on the third day after Jesus' alleged crucifixion? In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 1, it says the reason why she went was to massage him, to anoint him. Nobody anoints dead bodies on the third day. It just doesn't make any sense. She probably saw life on his body and she wanted to massage him. But she's not going to yell that Jesus is alive, or the Jews and the Romans will put him to death again. So she secretly goes back there to massage him. She was looking for a live Jesus. In John chapter 20, verse 1, in Mark chapter 16, verse 4, Mary finds that the stone has been removed from the wine she's unwound. If Jesus really was resurrected, he would have been able to pass right through the stone, since resurrected bodies are spiritualized. In John chapter 20, verse 15, Jesus sees Mary weeping. And Mary sees that Jesus is disguised as a gardener. Now, why would Jesus be disguised as a gardener? Do resurrected bodies look like gardeners? No. The reason why was because he was afraid of the Jews. Because if the Jews and Romans found out that he survived, they would put him to death again. And if he really was resurrected, he wouldn't be afraid of the Jews, because according to Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, a man dies only once. Then after that is judgment day. So Jesus says in Luke, in the Gospel of Luke chapter 20, verse 36, that resurrected bodies can't die once they're resurrected. After Mary realizes that Jesus has come back, she rushes to him in John chapter 20, verse 15 through 17. Jesus then tells her not to touch him. Now, why would she, in John 20, chapter 20, verse 17? He probably didn't want her to touch him because it would physically hurt him. I mean, can you imagine the emotional ordeal, the physical ordeal Jesus went through when he was put on the cross? This means that Jesus had not died. Jesus was never resurrected, proving he was alive. He was kept alive throughout the whole process. Even the disciples of Jesus hear that Jesus was alive from Mary Magdalene. In nowhere in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John does it say that Jesus was resurrected. The word is risen, and risen could be that Jesus rose up, for example, I rose today from my bed. So it could be something like that. But nowhere in any of the Gospels does it say that Jesus was resurrected. There's not a single verse in any of the Gospels that say that. And of course, there's the sign of Jonah, where Jesus says, "Whereas Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." And the only way Jesus could have fulfilled the sign was if he survived it. If Jesus did not fulfill the sign of Jonah, then he is a liar. And as a Muslim, I cannot accept that. So I strongly believe that Jesus survived the ordeal. Just like Jonah survived his ordeal. If you go back to the book of Jonah, you can read that Jonah clearly survived. Everybody knows the story of Jonah. Jonah clearly survived his ordeal, so I think Jesus survived his ordeal in order for the sign of Jonah to be true. And you can find this in Matthew chapter 12, verse 38 through 40. The time factor that Christian apologists constantly boast about really doesn't work, because Jesus was in the tomb for 1 day and 2 nights. So even the time factor they boast about doesn't really cut it. Jesus was allegedly crucified on a Friday, then on Sunday, Mary went to the tomb. So it's clearly, Jesus was in the tomb clearly 1 day and 2 nights. So Jesus survived his crucifixion. He was alive the entire time. The Quran never says that somebody else was put on the cross instead of Jesus. I fully agree with Mr. Wood that is ridiculous, and it doesn't make much sense. And God is not a deceiver. I don't believe that. So I'd like everyone to keep that in mind. But the death and resurrection of Jesus is the cornerstone for Christianity. If there's no death of Jesus, if there's no resurrection, there's no Christianity. And you can clearly see that Paul was preaching a spiritual resurrection. He was not preaching a physical resurrection. So I'm just going to list a list of proofs that Jesus survived his crucifixion, didn't die on the cross. I don't know how much time I have, but I'll go as quickly as possible. Point number 1, Jesus was put on the cross for only 3 hours. Death by crucifixion took typically days, and it's not possible for anyone to die 3 hours on the cross. If you read the scripture, it says Pontius Pilate knew from experience that no man can die so soon by crucifixion. He suspected that Jesus was alive. Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verse 44. Number 2, Jesus' 2 crossmates were alive, proving that even Jesus was alive. In Mark, chapter 15, verse 32, Luke, chapter 23, verse 39 to 43, John, chapter 19, verse 32. Point number 3, Jesus' legs were not broken by the Romans. Further evidence that Jesus was alive and survived the crucifixion. Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 33. Point number 4, the stone was removed and the winding sheets were unwound, proving that Jesus was alive. Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 1 through 4. Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 1 through 7. And point number 5, Jesus was disguised as a gardener. Why would resurrected bodies need to be disguised as a gardener? This only makes sense if Jesus was trying to hide from the Jews and Romans. He was hiding because of the fear that they would kill him again. And point number 6 is, according to Jim Bishop, not the Bible, Jim Bishop, it says the tomb of Jesus was big and spacious, and this was only necessary if Jesus was alive. Jesus again forbids Mary Magdalene from touching him. This is because Jesus was a physical body, and it would hurt, and he was not fully healed. Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 15 through 17. Point number 8 is Jesus says that he had not descended onto his Father, which means he was alive. John chapter 20, verse 17. In the upper room, Jesus shows his hands and feet and shows he wasn't a spirit, but he was alive. Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 36 through 49. The testimony of the men around the tomb, why does he seek the living amongst the dead? Luke chapter 24, verse 43. Jesus was not dead, whether he was alive. The testimony of the angels, angels say that Jesus was alive in Luke chapter 24, verse 23. And the angels did not say that he was resurrected, but rather the angels said he was alive. And there's more evidence that Jesus was alive. I just can't get to it because I have maybe about 4 minutes. Thus, I believe that the swoon theory that Jesus fainted on the cross and came back 3 days later while healing himself while in the tomb vindicates the Quran's account of the crucifixion. Now let's get to the historical, the English word crucify means to put to death by fasting on the cross. For a person to be crucified, he should die on the cross. If he doesn't, he's not crucified. Now let's get to the historical record real quick. It gets worse for these Christian apologists because there were 60 historians in the first century Roman world, yet only 2 Christian sources in the entire first century mentioned that Jesus was crucified. Here I'll analyze both Josephus and Tacitus and why they should not be trusted as evidence really quickly. Josephus, the account of Josephus, many scholars think that Josephus' a short account of Jesus actually came from an interpretation from a later church father, most likely Espostus. Josephus was born in 37 CE, well after the alleged crucifixion. So that puts him out of range from an eyewitness account. Moreover, he wrote his Antiquities, his book of historical evidence, in 93 after the Gospels were written. Therefore, the accounts of Josephus that Jesus died on the cross can only serve as hearsay. It's not good evidence. The second evidence is Tacitus, was a Roman historian born in 64. This puts him, he was born in 64 CE, and this puts him well after the alleged crucifixion of Jesus. He gives a brief mention he wrote his book around 109 CE, so it gets worse because he gives no source for his material. And he wrote his book Annals during the formation of Christianity, which shows that writings can only provide us with hearsay accounts. In the story of a God dying and being resurrected is not unique at all. There were at least 3 pagan pre-Christian gods who were buried and believed to have done this. The first pre-Christian man to be buried and resurrected in his lifetime is the Tarishian god Zel-Odis, who was described in the mid-5th century BC by Herodotus and also mentioned in the 4th century BC. So this pagan god buried himself alive, telling his followers to be resurrected in 3 days, and he came back. Another pre-Christian god that was crucified and resurrected is Inanna, a Sumerian goddess whose crucifixion and resurrection and escape from the underworld is told in clay tablets in 1500 BCE, which asserts a very old tradition. And of course, there's Apollonius of Tyana. Apollonius of Tyana was born just before Jesus, and he was referred to as Son of God. He performed miracles, and he ascended. He was resurrected and ascended to heaven. So, since I'm out of time, there are 3. So there's no good evidence that Jesus died on the cross. People have survived far worse. The Sumerians used to do a lot worse to their victims. They survived. And Josephus himself said that 3 people were crucified, one was taken down. So I strongly urge Christians here to consider the Islamic point that Jesus was not crucified or killed. He survived the crucifixion. This is more naturalistic. This is more possible naturalistically. Thank you.
We're now going to continue the next section of the debate. Now we're going to have 12-minute rebuttals from both sides. First from David Wood and then from Ehteshaam Gulam. Now, David Ehteshaam has laid out his claim, and I think it is one of the best defenses of the swoon theory that I have seen. He says the Quran does not say substitution theory. In fact, he calls it ridiculous. And then he says that there's no real way of knowing whether Jesus died, and it was all hearsay when people said he died anyway. The post-Easter events, such as Mary going to the tomb, or Jesus getting in a gardener's disguise, saying, "Don't touch me," these things all support the idea that Jesus, in fact, did not die on the cross. And he says the word resurrected isn't even written within the Gospels, and he also says the sign of Jonah, if true, would make Jesus a liar if he did die on the cross. So, David, you have 12 minutes to respond to this case.
Well, I thank Ehteshaam for that opening statement and Nabil for defending it. Now that we have a better idea of Ehteshaam's position, I can respond to the evidence he's offered. After that, I'll point out several problems with the swoon theory that he's offered, and if I have time, I'll compare our views in terms of ancient sources, historical feasibility, and scholarly support. I was pleased to hear that Ehteshaam rejects the traditional Muslim view, substitution theory. This is a point of agreement between us, so that will stand throughout this debate. The question for us is whether swoon theory is any better, the idea that Jesus was nailed to the cross, but that he survived. So we'll look at this. Ehteshaam says that according to the earliest Christians, resurrection was a spiritual event, and this is correct, but that did not mean, the way they use this did not mean non-bodily. When they said resurrection meant that the body was upheld and sustained by the Spirit. This is why first century Jews were so careful about preserving bones and preserving bodies. Even if a victim was crucified, they wanted to preserve the person's blood because they believed that all of that was going to be raised. So resurrection was a physical event. And just to make this clear, here are a few passages, because Ehteshaam appealed to the Apostle Paul for his claim that resurrection was spiritual, not physical. Again, the Christian view is that it's both. In Romans 8:11, we read from the Apostle Paul, "But if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you." So it's the raising of the mortal body through the power of the Spirit. This is what Paul means when he says that resurrection is spiritual. We can see the same thing in the same exact chapter that Ehteshaam quoted. If you go down to verse 42, Paul says, "So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown a perishable body. It is raised an imperishable body. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body." So there is a continuity of the body. The body that dies is the body that is raised. To deny this is simply to misrepresent both Christianity and Judaism, which shared this common belief. Ehteshaam says that early Christians believe in a spiritual resurrection. That's simply false. If you said to someone in the first century, spiritual resurrection meaning no body, they would say that's not resurrection. What in the world are you talking about? Ehteshaam says that Paul wasn't taught the gospel by anyone, so it's not historical. Well, he appeals to Galatians 1, where Paul says that he did receive the gospel through revelation. If you keep reading to the end of the chapter and then go on to the next chapter, you'll see that Paul repeatedly goes up to Jerusalem to talk to the disciples, Jesus' original followers, to make sure that his gospel was in line with theirs. So the gospel that Paul received through revelation, Paul made sure that it lined up with Jesus' apostles. I wish Muhammad had done the same with his claims about Jesus. He says that there were 60 writers in the first century, but only 2 non-Christian sources. I want to put this in perspective here. The ancient sources that we're dealing with. The Roman emperor during the time of Jesus was Tiberius. The most powerful man on the entire planet was the Emperor Tiberius. How many sources do we have on the life of Tiberius written within 150 years, within a century and a half of the life of Tiberius? How many sources do we have that mention that he even existed? We have 10. And one of those is the Bible. So we're not dealing with a lot of sources reporting various events. This is 10 sources on the Roman emperor, the most powerful man in the world. I gave more than 10 sources in my opening statement for Jesus' death. So we have more historical sources supporting Jesus' death than we do sources supporting the existence of the Roman emperor. This is not a small amount of evidence. This is an astounding amount of evidence. Ehteshaam appeals to pagan myths. This is absolutely absurd. There isn't a scholar, a credible scholar on the planet who believes that Christian belief in Jesus' death on the cross was inspired by pagan myths. He pointed out a couple. I'll just respond very quickly to the Inanna story. He said this was a crucifixion and resurrection. If you go to the Inanna story, Inanna was a love goddess who invaded the underworld. She went down to the underworld. The gods of the underworld gave her this death stare. They could all stare at you very sternly, and it would cause you to drop dead. Once she had dropped dead, they hung her on a hook. And later on, some friends raised her. Ehteshaam says this is the sort of thing where Christians must have gotten their idea that Jesus died on the cross. Is this a crucifixion and resurrection? No, and it's the same thing with the rest of these stories. People say, hung on a hook, that's just like crucifixion. No, it's not. And besides, Christianity arose in the first century Israel. These people had nothing but contempt for the views of the pagans. Christians were slaughtered for 3 centuries because they would not compromise with the views of the pagans. When we add to this the fact that Jesus' death was a public event, we can either believe that someone just invented this based on pagan myths, or that the reason Jesus' death caused so many people to believe in it was that they saw him actually die on the cross. I think the second view is far more plausible, and this is a view held by virtually every scholar who's ever lived on this issue. So, we can discuss that more later on, but now let's look at some of the evidence Ehteshaam has offered. According to Ehteshaam, Jesus was only on the cross for 3 hours, which isn't long enough for someone to die. This is simply false. Many people who were crucified died just from the beating, died during the beating, and then they would just hang a dead body on the cross. So 3 hours is plenty of time. Besides that, it was a bit longer. He says that Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already dead. True, some people did last longer, but again, this depended on the beating. If you hit more arteries, then people would die. In addition, Christians believe that Jesus willingly gave up the ghost. He says that the 2 rebels crucified with Jesus were alive, which proves that Jesus must have been alive as well. Again, many people died simply from the beating. And actually, if the Romans wanted to be more merciful, they didn't give you a lighter beating, they gave you a more severe beating, so that you would die more quickly and not be hanging in agony for too long. He says that since the Romans didn't break Jesus' legs, he must have been alive. Actually, this proves the opposite. The Romans broke your legs when they wanted to speed up death. If they didn't break your legs, it's because they already knew that you were dead. So this proves the opposite. He says that the stone was removed and the sheets were unwound. This shows that Jesus was still alive. Well, not when you understand physical resurrection. Resurrection, again, was a physical event. Jesus would have been raised with his body and so would have removed the stone. He says that Jesus was disguised as a gardener. Why would Jesus need to disguise himself unless he was hiding? The passage doesn't say Jesus was disguised as a gardener. Mary goes to the tomb. There's a garden there, and she hears someone talk to her, and it says she assumed that it was the gardener. This doesn't say Jesus was wearing any sort of disguise. He says Jesus' tomb was big, therefore he must have been alive. Well, Jewish tombs were big because several generations of people would all be buried in the same tomb. That's why they were spacious. It's not as if it was big because they were making an apartment for Jesus. It says Mary went to the tomb to anoint Jesus. Why would she go to anoint Jesus? Well, in the sources, they had to rush through the burial because it was about to be a holiday. They had to rush. So the first opportunity for Mary to go and anoint the body would have been Sunday morning, which is what the sources say she did. It says Jesus tells Mary Magdalene not to touch him. This must be because he was hurt. This isn't actually what the passage says. And Rick doesn't say that he said, don't touch me. It says Jesus said, don't cling to me. Why? Because he had a job to do. She was supposed to go and tell the disciples to meet with Jesus. There's nothing here about Jesus being in pain. It says Jesus hadn't ascended to the Father, showing that he hadn't died. That can't be. That can't possibly be what the book of John means. How do we know? Well, earlier in the same chapter, verse 9, it says that Jesus had to rise again from the dead. So Jesus' death and resurrection are part of the context here. So Jesus can't possibly mean that he didn't die. What does he mean then when he says he hasn't ascended to the Father? Well, this obviously refers to Jesus' ascension, which happened later. Ehteshaam says that Jesus showed the disciples his hands and feet, proving that he was in spirit. Jewish and Christians believe that when you're resurrected, you have hands and feet. It's not a problem. It says Jesus eats with the disciples. Resurrected bodies can't eat. Early Christian and Jewish belief, resurrection was physical. It says the disciples were surprised with Jesus because he had survived. Well, no, they were surprised because he had been crucified. If you see him again, that is a shock. So I don't know how this supports his view. He says that the disciples weren't eyewitnesses. Well, according to sources, John was. We know that Peter actually went to the trial, and in addition to that, the women, Jesus' women followers, were certainly witnesses of the crucifixion. And besides that, thousands and thousands and thousands of people would have been there to witness the crucifixion. Jews, Romans, and even a few believers in Jesus witnessed this event. It was a public event. It says, the angel, Mary, and disciples all said that Jesus was alive. Right, if you're resurrected, you're alive. We agree with that. They don't say that he survived. He finally appeals to the sign of Jonah. He says, that the sign of Jonah shows that Jesus would survive crucifixion just as Jonah survived in the flesh. Is this what Jesus meant? Of course not. How do we know? Well, what's the context of this passage? In the book of Matthew, where Jesus says over and over again that he would die on the cross. That's the context. So does it make sense to think here that Jesus all of a sudden contradicts everything else he says to the apostles? No. If there's an interpretation that makes sense in light of the evidence, that makes sense in the context, then you go with the interpretation that fits the context. And Jesus repeatedly says, in the Gospel of Matthew, I'm going up to Jerusalem, there they're going to crucify me, kill me, and I'm going to rise from the dead. So if we have an interpretation that fits this context, we should go with this interpretation. Do we have an interpretation of the sign of Jonah that fits the actual context? Of course. Jesus' point is that if you get swallowed by a fish or a sea monster, you're not coming out. If you do, it's a miracle. Similarly, if you die, you get swallowed by death. If you come out, it's a miracle. The interpretation that I've offered makes perfect sense. It fits the context, unlike Ehteshaam's interpretation, which makes Jesus totally contradictory. But there are additional problems with the Muslim view. Jesus says that he's going to spend 3 days in the heart of the earth. What does this mean? Well, this is a Jewish phrase that refers to Sheol, the place of the dead. You see the same thing in Psalm 63:9, where David says, "But those who seek my life to destroy it will go down to the depths of the earth." This was a phrase that referred to Sheol. So Jesus clearly says he's going to die. He's going to the place of the dead. Another problem for Ehteshaam is that many interpreters believe that Jonah did die when he was swallowed by the fish. This is based on Jonah's statement in Jonah 2:2, where he says, "I cried for help from the depth of Sheol." Jonah says this, and 2:6, "I descended to the roots of the mountains. The earth with its bars was around me, but you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God." Based on this, some Jewish interpreters conclude that Jonah was killed. But either way, the only interpretation that fits the context is the interpretation that Jesus died by crucifixion. This is what Christianity has always taught.
Thank you, David. And now we're going to hear Ehteshaam's response. Ehteshaam, David provided 4 main points in his opening statement. He said that all reliable sources promote Jesus' death on the crucifixion. What we know about Roman crucifixion practices will tell us that Jesus died on the cross. All scholars agree with this, and that Muslim attempts fail to account for the death of Jesus on the cross. In his rebuttal, he responded to various and sundry points that you had brought up. We're looking forward to what you have to say in response, Ehteshaam.
Okay, there are several problems with these so-called these evidences that Mr. Wood is holding up that claim that Jesus died. Well, the problem with the Gospels is that they're all anonymous. They were all written anonymously by Greek writers. No historian will ever say that the Gospels are biographies. Rather, they're symbolic messages. The Gospels are based on unreliable oral traditions, and they were written very late. They were written late in the 1st century, etc., etc. Now, let me get to the pagan god Diana, who was crucified and resurrected 1,000 years before Christ. There's no denying that there was a pre-Christian goddess who was resurrected and crucified. The evidence shows that. Okay, sorry about that. We can't rule it out because this story of somebody dying and being resurrected is conformed to clay tablets, 1500 BCE. It's a very old tradition, so we can't. So the idea of worshiping a crucified deity did create Christianity. It had entered Jewish society within Palestine. How much of the Christians were influenced by that, I don't know. But we can't rule it out. And of course, there's Apollonius of Tyana, which he didn't touch on. Apollonius of Tyana was born right before Jesus, and he had the same, powers or miracles as him. And he also was resurrected and ascended to heaven. The historical evidence for Josephus' account and Tacitus' accounts are also weak. He didn't really touch on that. Again, Josephus does not give any
sources to his material. Same with Tacitus. Sorry about that. Yeah, again, Josephus was born in 37 CE. Jesus was allegedly crucified in 33 CE. This puts him at least. This means that Josephus was not an eyewitness to the account. Tacitus, again, same problem. Tacitus was born in 64 CE. This puts him well after the alleged crucifixion of Jesus, and he wrote his book in 109 CE. He gives no source for his material. So we can see the historical record is also weak outside the New Testament. Again, 60 historians, I find this odd that only two non-Christian sources in the entire first century mention Jesus was crucified, and that to Josephus is a fabrication. Many scholars believe that Josephus' account is interpretation by a later church father. And Tacitus, well, he was just repeating what Christians were saying, and the fact that Tacitus was born after the alleged crucifixion of Jesus, and that he wrote his book after the formation of Christianity, showing that his writings can only provide for hearsay accounts. Let's see here. Now it's commonly said that the objection of a physical resurrection, that a Pharisee would not believe in a spiritual resurrection, since the Talmud and the Mishnah, both Pharisee texts, these Jewish texts, tell only of a rising of corpse. Now that's not true, because when Paul converted to Christianity, he flatly rejected the Pharisee doctrine. When he became a Christian, he rejected strict adherence to Jewish law and diet and covenant and circumcision, things no Pharisee could have done. It is sometimes said that no Jew would have believed in a spiritual resurrection, but that is not true, since it was only the sect of the Pharisees, not the Sadducees or the Essenes or the Merid or any other ideologies among the faction of Jews, which insisted on a resurrection of the flesh. This may explain Paul's persecution of the church, as his complete rejection of Pharisaism upon converting could be explained that Christianity rejected the Pharisee concept of a resurrection of the flesh. Now, quickly getting to his points. Mr. Wood brought up how Jesus survived his scourging and his torture, as well as the crucifixion itself and the burial, but that's not necessary. All victims of crucifixion were routinely scourged and frequently tortured beforehand, and thus if people regularly survived for days, and all the evidence suggests they did, this means they regularly survived for days despite any additional torture. All accounts we have, all the Gospels show that Jesus was alive after any torture he suffered, so we do not have to account for his surviving it. All the Gospels already say he did. It is not remarkable. Again, people have survived worse in history. The removal of tongue, nose, and ears was a common punishment in Samaria, and you can bet that they did not use anesthetics, asthmatics, or stentures, and this was all to survive. And that was in fact the point of doing it. As for burial, survival in a roomy tomb was never going to present a problem. And again, Josephus himself witnessed three people crucified, and one survived. So that makes his survival even more likely. Now let's say that there's absolutely all evidence that Jesus died, even though I don't believe it, even though I don't see it, that Jesus died on the cross. Would this, invalidate the Quran? No, it wouldn't. Because what some Muslims have said, and I don't believe this, but some Muslims have said that Jesus' soul left his body, and that the Jews and Romans crucified an empty body. And that's what vindicates the Quran when the Quran says that they did not kill him or crucify him, but it only looked like he did. But they only looked like they did. And again, nowhere in the Gospels does it say that Jesus was resurrected. Paul was clearly teaching a spiritual resurrection. He clearly says the body that he saw is not the body that rises. Even 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 18 says that Jesus was put to death and the flesh but made alive in spirit. So the early Christians believed in the spiritual resurrection, not a physical resurrection. Paul clearly says that resurrection is spiritual, not physical. And again, the resurrection, the physical resurrection of Jesus is extremely weak because no historian mentions it. Paul never mentions any empty tombs. None of the stories we find in the Gospels, etc., etc. And again, the word is alive. It's not resurrected. So when the angels are saying this, they're saying that Jesus survived. And again, even if you read Acts chapter 2 verse 24, it says Jesus escaped the stings of death, and Jesus never showed himself to his enemies because he had escaped death. He was alive. The idea. It's very possible. It's what I believe that Jesus survived his crucifixion. I strongly believe that there is tons of evidence in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that clearly prove this. Again, the sign of Jonah, whereas Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights, so should the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the part of the earth. This clearly, Jesus is clearly predicting the survival of what the Jews are doing, and I hope that this opens this convinces you of the truth of Islam, that Islam is right, that the most logical, that the most naturalistic position is that Jesus survived his crucifixion. Now he says that almost all scholars agree that Jesus was killed on the cross. Well, that's not true. Venturi in the 17th century came up with the claim that Jesus survived his crucifixion. So we at least have one historian that agrees with that. And of course, there's books like the Da Vinci Code and the Jesus Papers, which you can read, which also support that Jesus survived his cross. Let's see, what else I wanted to say. Yeah, that's it. So again, you can see that the historical record is extremely weak. Josephus' account is weak. Tacitus' account is extremely weak. There was a pre-Christian guy who was crucified and was resurrected. Nowhere in the Gospels does it say that Jesus was resurrected. Jesus clearly shows his hands and feet to his disciples, saying that he was a physical body, not a spiritual body. Jesus is clear. Paul is clearly preaching about a spiritual resurrection, not a physical resurrection. So I strongly urge every Christian here to consider the Islamic point, and maybe the point of, I hope this debate opens your view that Islam is more closer to the historical Jesus than Christianity itself. There are a number of problems with Christianity I have. For example, why would God kill his only begotten son? Why couldn't he just forgive everybody? And if God so loved the world, why couldn't he just forgive? Why did he have to kill his own son? This seems kind of contradictory to me. I believe in a power. I believe life on earth is a test, a trial, a challenge, and not a punishment. And what happens to the people before Jesus? Are they punished or do they gain salvation? That's a question that kind of bothers me about Christianity. So I strongly encourage Christians to look more into the teachings of Islam and to consider that Islam has more evidence for Jesus than traditional Christianity has, and that Islam is more close to the historical Jesus than Christianity is. Again, Paul never met the historical Jesus. He's talking about a spiritual resurrection. I keep saying that, that's the Gospels are all anonymous. They're all written by anonymous Greek writers, and people have survived far worse in history. Jesus' survival is very naturalistic and very possible. And that's it. Thank you.
We're now moving to the third round of debate. It's going pretty well. We have lots of very insightful ideas from both sides. What we're going to do now is 8-minute rebuttals from both sides. This is our second rebuttal, and immediately after this we'll be doing crossfire. David, it seems that Ehteshaam has provided some more arguments. He said that the Gospels are in fact not biographies, and pre-Christian dying and rising gods simply cannot be ruled out as a source for the resurrection. Historical records that do indicate Jesus died are weak. For example, Josephus and Tacitus. Josephus was potentially even a fabrication, according to Ehteshaam. People have survived crucifixion and worse in history. And he also provides a theological argument. Why kill your son instead of just forgiving everyone? And he repeats some of the same arguments that he did in his opening statement as well, such as the resurrection is spiritual, not physical, and the word resurrection is not even used. David, you have 8 minutes to respond.
All right, I'll respond to as much as I can. Ehteshaam says that the Gospels are anonymous. Well, the way you did things in the first century, in first century Greco-Roman biographies, you put them forward as anonymous. But if you're going to say that, if you turn to a chapter of the Quran, it doesn't say who wrote it. It's anonymous in that sense. We know who wrote the Gospels because we have later Christians who were in a reliable position to know who wrote the Gospels. We have Irenaeus listing all 4 Gospel writers. Who was he? He was a disciple of Polycarp. Who was Polycarp? A disciple of the Apostle John. Would he have known who wrote the Gospels? Seems like he was in a good position, so I have no reason to doubt that. And besides this, we know from the end of the first century, these Gospels were considered authoritative scripture. So they must have been written by someone, and we do have names attached to them from people who are in a position to know the truth. It says, no scholar will say the Gospels are biographies. That's exactly the opposite of what scholars say. Even scholars who reject the Gospels will say that the genre is first century Greco-Roman biography. That's simply a fact. He says, again, that Paul believed in a spiritual resurrection. True, it was spiritual. The body was raised and empowered by the Spirit. He quotes 1 Corinthians again, saying that the body that dies is not the body that rises. Keep reading. He says because it dies, it's perishable, it rises, referring to the same body throughout, it rises imperishable. It's sown in weakness, it's raised in power. It's the same body. Is it different when it's raised? Of course it is. It's regenerated. So, this was clearly Paul's view. There's no question about that, and he didn't respond to the references I made to Paul. I quoted Paul showing that this is the correct view. He again turns to the pagan myth theory. Again, I see this as incredibly desperate. Show me some scholars, some modern respectable scholars who say that belief in Jesus' crucifixion was inspired by these ancient pagan myths. I know no scholar who maintains this. And again, when you look at the ones that that Muslims appeal to and atheists appeal to, you look at these sources and someone's hanging on the hook. Oh, that's crucifixion. That's just like it. That's just like it. Some god who's been killed by other gods rises. That's just like Jesus' resurrection. No, these aren't things that occurred in history. These aren't things where you have historical records of, I saw this happen. In Christianity, we have tons of evidence based in the first century that Jesus died and witnesses that we would see him alive again after he died. It says that Josephus and Tacitus were very late and that he's surprised that we have only 2 first century, 2 early sources. Well, again, we have all of the Christian sources. We have a creed going back to within 5 years. The pre-Markan Passion area may go back to within 7 years. We have the other sources. And by the way, I'm surprised that we do have 2 non-Christian sources, if we leave out Thales, of course. I'm surprised that we do have 2 non-Christian sources. Jesus was a Jewish peasant. We should be shocked that we have people from far outside in the Roman Empire. Sorry, I have a cold. In the Roman Empire mentioning this first century Jewish carpenter. He says that all victims were scourged, and therefore, it makes no, so I can't appeal to that. No, he said that someone couldn't die in just a few hours. A ton of people died just from the scourging, and a ton of people died at every interval in between. Can he say that Jesus was scourged just in the exact same way that the other victims were scourged? Of course not. In fact, it makes sense to think that Jesus was scourged because Pilate wanted to beat Jesus so severely that the Jews would let him go, and that didn't satisfy them. And so it seems that Jesus would have received a more severe beating. And again, if the Romans wanted to put someone out of misery, they would beat them more severely. Ehteshaam says that Josephus witnessed 3 people being crucified and 1 survived. What he didn't tell you is that all 3 of them were pardoned. So they've been nailed to the cross. All 3 of them get pardoned. They take them down. They bring in their doctors, and they try to keep these people alive. They hadn't gone through the death blow, as Jesus did, spear through the heart. They hadn't gone through the entire process of asphyxiation, of eventually wearing out and dying. They didn't go through any of this. And they were all 3 pardoned. They took them down, gave them the best medical care that the Roman Empire could give. 2 of them died anyway. That doesn't support the Muslim view. This supports the Christian view. Crucifixion. Anyone who goes through the entire process is dead. And show me one person anywhere in all of history to survive the full crucifixion. He says there's no evidence for the physical resurrection. Well, the Gospels declare that Jesus, the sources he appeals to say that Jesus rose, and according to him, it says that this resurrection was physical. He had a physical body. That, by definition, is resurrection, according to the sources he appealed to. So we have no evidence for Ehteshaam's view, and that would be reason enough for rejecting it, but we can go further, because there are a ton of problems with shroom theory. Let me list a few of them so he has a chance to respond. Again, first, all of our early sources declare that Jesus died by crucifixion. Even the sources that Ehteshaam appealed to plainly declare that Jesus died. For instance, Mark 9:37 declares that Jesus breathed his last. Mark 27:50 declares that Jesus yielded up his spirit. Luke 23:46 says, and Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. John 19:30 says that Jesus bowed his head and gave up the spirit. These are the books that he's appealing to for his evidence. And what do they say? Jesus died. Second, while we're on the topic of sources, I showed that the Old Testament, we have an Old Testament source for Jesus' death. Prophecy in Isaiah 53. We have other prophecies in the Old Testament. Were all these prophecies wrong? Because if they weren't fulfilled in Jesus, who were they fulfilled in? Third, Jesus also predicted his death. Ehteshaam said, I can't believe that Jesus didn't fulfill the sign of Jonah because I can't believe that Jesus would say something that didn't come true. Well, Jesus repeatedly says in the Gospels that he's going to die. In Mark 9:31, it says Jesus was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. Jesus says things like this over and over and over again. Now, if you say you believe in Jesus, and you say you believe in these sources, you have to believe that Jesus died on the cross, because that's what he said. If not, Jesus was a false prophet. If he's a false prophet, Islam is false. Fourth, an angel at the empty tomb of Jesus said that he had risen from the dead. In Matthew 28, the books again, that Ehteshaam was appealing to, the angel says to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who has been crucified. The Quran says not crucified. The source that Ehteshaam is appealing to says Jesus was crucified. Go and tell his disciples quickly that he has risen from the dead. This is the angel. It was the angel line. If you don't believe Jesus, do you believe the angel? Fifth, we know that the early Jewish opponents of Christianity were convinced that Jesus died by crucifixion. That's just a fact. Six, we can see how inconsistent Muslims have to be in order to maintain a position like this. They go to the New Testament to support their claims, but then they ignore all the verses that refute their claims. And Muslims would never allow me to do this with the Quran. If I went to the Quran, cherry-picked verses, and then ignored everything else, Muslims would say, how dare you do this? You have to look at these verses in context. And yet, they violate this fundamental rule of scriptural interpretation. Seventh, I showed in my opening statement, surviving Roman crucifixion was impossible by naturalistic means. We have no record of anyone surviving the full brunt of Roman crucifixion. And so the only way that you can say Jesus survived is if you say it's a miracle. But if you say it was a miracle, then you're bringing God back in as a deceiver, which is why we reject substitution theory as well. Eighth, there's a consensus among scholars that swoon theory is completely absurd. I invited Ehteshaam to share some scholars who support this view. He said, well, there's one in the 17th century. I don't think that's good evidence.
Ehteshaam, David just provided some responses saying that the Gospels actually are biographies following the pattern of Greco-Roman biographies. He emphasized Paul's statements again that these are actually a spiritual and bodily resurrection. He says that the dying gods do not parallel Jesus in any way. The stories of dying and rising gods simply aren't parallels. And he says Jesus was given an extra harsh scourging, which goes beyond a normal crucifixion. And then he says that no one survived a full crucifixion. The account that you gave was one of 3 people who didn't have a full crucifixion. And then he gave 8 reasons not to believe the swoon theory. And we're really looking forward to your response. You have 8 minutes to respond to the show.
Okay, getting to this quickly. These so-called 300 prophecies in the Old Testament are very silly. He talks about, Muslims need to read it in context. Well, Christians also need to read the Old Testament in context. When Christian apologists say, well, the 300 prophecies saying the Messiah will come and that Messiah is Jesus. Well, if you read it in context, it falls apart.
As for the Gospels, well, no modern scholar will ever say that the Gospels are true. The Irenaeus account, the early church father account, is extremely weak because he gives no sources for his claim. Plus, he says that the reason why we have 4 Gospels is because there's 4 pillars holding up the earth. This is just silly. That's why I don't believe it. If you read Charles Tolbert's book, What is a Gospel? He writes that Gospels are fictional, are modeled after fictional accounts. And if you read Dennis MacDonald's The Homer Epics and the Gospel of Mark, this also shows that the Gospels are modeled after some kind of fictional account. But I do believe that there is some historical data in the New Testament. Anyways, Jesus had the same body in John 20. If you read the story of the doubting Thomas, Jesus shows his wounds to doubting Thomas. So Jesus' body was not transformed. He still had the same old body. And it's highly doubtful. It's highly doubtful that there was a basic belief in early Christianity. Early Christianity was extremely diverse in its early years. There were different early Christian churches, like there was a church of Corinth, the church of Galatia, the church of Rome, etc., etc. And these different churches had many different scriptures, etc., etc. And some of these scriptures were different from what Christianity teaches. Like there's the Apocalypse of Peter that says, well, Jesus wasn't crucified, instead a demon was crucified. And there's the early Christian group, the Thessalonians, who used to believe that Simon was crucified instead of Jesus, etc., etc. So even that is weak. It's highly doubtful that there was a charisma, or a basic belief, that Jesus died and was resurrected. Again, Jesus, he mentioned that Jesus foretells his death, his alleged death, and crucifixion. Well, Jesus could be referring to that in his second coming, that Jesus would die and rise in his second coming. That's very possible. Getting to this pagan myths, there are some people who think Christianity itself is so unique that it would be inspired by God. But again, there was a crucified Messiah, and some people say that a crucified Messiah would be rather absurd for the people of Jesus. But again, crucified deities were not absurd to the Sumerians. The Sumerians clearly worshipped the crucified Iana. The Greeks and the Persians also suffered a similar fate, and there was a popular religion of Ehteshaam who was also similar to Jesus, etc. Let me getting back to the swoon theory. Death by crucifixion typically took days, and all the accounts show that Jesus survived the torture or scourging he went through, and Jesus was only on the cross for 3 hours. It's simply not possible for someone to die on the cross for 3 hours. And Jesus' 2 crossmates were also alive. They also suffered the same torture and whipping that Jesus went through. Therefore, more evidence that Jesus was alive. And if Jesus did die on the cross, his blood would clot, and no blood would gush out of his body when his side was pierced. But the Gospel of John states that the blood and water came on. Therefore, there's more evidence that Jesus was alive. Jesus clearly going back to that story in Luke. Jesus clearly says that a touch between sea for a spirit has no flesh and bones. Jesus is clearly saying that I'm alive. I'm not dead. The disciples were also overjoyed to see him. They were overjoyed because he was alive. Jesus, he shows his wounds to the doubting Thomas in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 25 to 27, showing that he did not have a supernaturally resurrected body, but rather he had his old body. Jesus most likely healed himself while in the tomb. So all the accounts we have is that, So all victims of crucifixion were routinely scourged and were tortured beforehand. Thus, people survived regularly for days, and all the evidence suggests they did. Again, people have survived far worse, so it's very possible that Jesus survived. All accounts already witnessed that he survived the torture beforehand. And again, Jesus was put on the cross for 3 hours, and the angel comes down and strengthens him to keep him alive. Let's see, here it goes. The Josephus account of Jesus, Josephus witnessing 3 people, 1 taken down, 1 survived. It is true that these were war victims, etc., but we can't rule that out. Of course, we have no way of really knowing that Jesus died on the cross. We simply cannot travel back in time with medical machinery, etc., and doctors to clarify it. But there is abundance of evidence that throws suspicion on the claim that he did. Again, we see a bunch of evidence which I clearly provided. Paul was clearly teaching some kind of spiritual resurrection. There's no really good evidence that he was teaching anything physical. He said that the body that is sown is not the body that rises. Rather we're given a new, imperishable body, and that's not what happened to Jesus. Jesus clearly had the same old body, so there are conflicting views over there. So in closing, I just want to say that Paul was not an eyewitness to the events of Jesus. So when Paul is saying, Jesus died, etc., that's not really good evidence for me. Paul is writing 20 years later, and he never mentions, the virgin birth, Jesus' miracles, or the trial beforehand. So Paul's account isn't really historical. And the disciples, again, were not eyewitnesses to the account. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verse 50 says, they all forsook him and fled. And in the Gospel of John, which was written a lot later, says John was right there. Well, there's a problem, because all 3 Gospels say none of the disciples were eyewitnesses to the crucifixion. And yet the Gospel of John is saying, well, John was there. So it's obviously an invention by whoever wrote the Gospel of John. Yes, and that's it.
Well, we have seen the opening statements from both sides. We've seen the first rebuttals and second rebuttals, but we're now going to have our crossfire statements. We're going to have first David come up for 2 minutes, and then Ehteshaam, and we'll see this 1-2 crossfire a total of 4 times. David, it seems that Ehteshaam has provided another response. He said that the Old Testament prophecies that you mentioned are actually kind of silly. He says the Gospels are modeled after fictional accounts, especially Mark's Gospel. Jesus' body was not transformed. He says that, of course, it's in the book of John, he's showing the holes. It's not a transformed body, it's the same old body. And as he said, quote, it's simply not possible for someone to die on the cross for 3 hours. He also provided the evidence that the fellow victims that were crucified were still alive next to him when he is said to have died. And it's very possible that he survived. There's simply no people who could go back in time to verify with medical equipment that he died. So David, you have 2 minutes to use for crossfire in any way you choose, and then it will be Ehteshaam. I will not be coming up in between these rounds, so please continue, and I will stop you when you're done.
Well, in order to show that the Gospels weren't Greco-Roman biographies, he appeals to Talbert and MacDonald and invite everyone to see how far off the center of scholarship these 2 men are, and to see what actual scholars generally maintain. The consensus is Greco-Roman biography. It says that there were different early churches, different scriptures, the Apocalypse of Peter. Well, when do you have these different early churches? 2nd century. I don't dispute that there were differences in the 2nd century. When we go to the 1st century, we see a clear consensus among every Christian record we have. Jesus died on the cross, claimed to be divine, rose from the dead. He says that Jesus' reference saying that he's going to die may be to the future. Well, let me go ahead and read one for you. As he was about to go up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves, and on the way he said to them, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles to mock and scourge and crucify him. And on the 3rd day, he will be raised up. So Jesus is saying it's when we're going up now. This can't possibly refer to some event during the second coming. Ehteshaam says that this Jesus' body wasn't transformed. Well, what accounts are you reading? Jesus could walk through walls with this resurrected body. It had supernatural powers. And besides, if it had just been the natural body, Jesus would have been crawling in on all fours with his back hanging in strips of ribbons. No one would have said, hey, he's risen. But they did say he's risen. Why? Because they understood that there was something different going on here. He says that we have no way of knowing that Jesus died on the cross. Well, 100% of people who've ever gone through scourging, crucifixion, and death blow have died. So we have this other person, we're going to wonder...
It's time.
Okay, the problems here are again, he claims the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies. Again, they're all anonymous. They're based on unreliable oral traditions. They're not, no scholar, I don't know any scholar that will ever say, well, the Gospels were ever written by Mark, or Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're all anonymous. And it gets worse because Jesus' original language is Aramaic. It was not Greek, and it's simply absurd to say that, well, these Gospels are translations from Aramaic to Greek. I mean, no translation would ever agree to such an extent. Let's see here. I highly encourage everybody to read Dennis MacDonald's book, The Homer Epics and the Gospel of Mark. That's an extremely good book, and I do agree there are some critics of that book, but that book shows that there are fictional forms in the Gospels. What else? I just want to say that it is very possible. I mean, again, we have no historical evidence in the first century that Jesus died on the cross. Again, we have conflicting views. In the first century, there was this term called diketium, that said Jesus' crucifixion was an illusion. So that also supports the Grimes account. What else? Again, there's I just listed tons of evidence that Jesus survived his ordeal. The sign of Jonah, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus was not talking about the time factor, but it was 1 day and 2 nights. Jesus is clearly saying that Jonah survived, I'm going to survive. Again, we have Josephus' account. Josephus himself witnessed three people were crucified, one survived. Therefore, the survival of Jesus is very likely. And the word is alive, not resurrected. Thank you.
Well, he continues to attack the Gospels, despite the fact that these are the sources he's appealing to. With that in mind, I'm going to address some issues of consistency right now. The people he appeals to, for instance, he appeals to Dennis MacDonald. He said, great book. Dennis MacDonald's view is that whoever wrote Mark was copying from the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that he was taking details from these and using them in a Christian context. When he's asked, why doesn't the Gospel of Mark look anything like the Homeric epics, he says, well, that's because they did a really great job disguising all of them. How many scholars support this view? One. MacDonald. And yet, this is the source we're supposed to go to. But now, again, I want to address consistency. He says, go to the one scholar who supports this view and go with that. Well, if I just wanted to go to Islam and look for one source, one scholar who says something, what would we come up with? Well, you might have seen in the media, Mohammed Sven Kalish, a convert to Islam, a Muslim scholar, recently concluded that Muhammad never existed. Now, suppose I stood up and I say, look, Mohammed Sven Kalish said Muhammad never existed, therefore Muhammad never existed, go with this scholar. He would think that's absolutely ridiculous, and I agree. I think it is absolutely ridiculous to say that Muhammad never existed. But I'm consistent. I apply the same standards to Christianity that I apply when I investigate Islam. What we see from Muslims is, we go to the Gospels, you find the most radical, anti-Christian, on the fringe scholars you can find state their views as facts, and all the actual scholars who come to a consensus about something, ignore all them. Who cares what they say? He again appeals to the pagan myths. Again, show me an actual scholar who supports these pagan myth theories as the origin of belief in Jesus' crucifixion. But while we're on, again, with the issue of consistency, where do you you think Muhammad got the idea that Jesus never died? We know that during the time of Muhammad, sources were circulating that said Jesus survived crucifixion. This is a pagan myth in the Quran.
Well, there's several inaccuracies over there. First of all, there were no, Bibles in Arabia, etc., etc. And plus, there was no accounts of Jesus surviving the crucifixion. This is something which, if you read the Gospels carefully, you clearly see that he survived. There were no sources in pre-Islamic Arabia, Christian, Jewish sources, etc., etc. Another problem here is that I challenge him to name at least one scholar that says, well, these are biographies. Nobody states that. The Gospels, again, were written by anonymous people. Therefore, we don't know for sure who wrote the Gospels. We don't know when they were written. And we do know that there are several problems. For example, if you read the Gospel of Matthew, in the end, it says a bunch of zombies came out after Jesus' crucifixion and started walking around. Well, that's not historical, and there's no historical evidence for the eclipse, etc., etc. Again, he brings up that the pagan myths are absurd, etc., etc. Well, again, we can't rule it out. There was that one goddess, Iana, which story of crucifixion and resurrection entered into first century Palestine. So it's very possible that Christians got their view from that. And again, keep in mind that Paul never mentions anything about a physical resurrection. It's clearly spiritual, and Jesus comes back as a physical body. The fact that he comes through locked doors, this is in the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John is a later invention, or it's a later book. The Synoptic Gospels, to me, are more accurate than the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is not a book of history, it's a book of theology. That's it.
He keeps saying over and over again that there's nothing in Paul that would indicate a resurrection of the physical body. I quoted in passages. If he wants, I can give him several more. I'll just quote this again since it's never been responded to. But if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his spirit who dwells in you. Mortal bodies being raised by the Spirit. Paul says things like this throughout his letters. So how can Muslims say Paul didn't believe that the body rises? What sense does this make? Again, if this is the method, I don't know what to say. If I went to the Quran and I said, the Quran supports Trinity. Well, what about this verse right here that denies Trinity? Quran supports Trinity. So again, I don't know what to do. He says there were no sources in Arabia giving a Muslim view. I did misspeak and said sources say that Jesus survived, and then was sources that say that there was a replacement for Jesus. We know that these sources were. Why? Because we find them in the early Muslim commentators. They talk about these views. So we know they were circulating during the time of Muhammad. And the only point here is he's saying, Ehteshaam is saying that if something is influenced by paganism, you can't trust it. We know where these sources came. These came from the Greeks. When the Greeks adapted Christianity, they took on these pagan beliefs. These are the views we find later on in the Quran. If you want to go against paganism, you have to reject everything Muhammad said. Where do you get circling the Kaaba, bowing down to the Kaaba, taking the pilgrimage to Mecca, kissing the black stone? These were all pagan practices. So if he's going to be consistent, yes, then we throw out everything Muhammad said. If we have to throw that out, we have to throw out Surah 4, 157. If we throw that out, we have absolutely no reason from any historical source ever to think that Jesus did anything but die on the cross and rise from the dead.
Mr. Wood fails to give any good evidence that there were these Christian and Jewish sources in Arabia. I mean, no scholar agrees with that. Pre-Islamic Arabia, the Arabs were illiterate, barbaric, etc. I mean, nobody had access to these Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or of the Old Testament. The Arabic translations of the Bible came much after the coming of Islam. He says that Islam has some kind of paganistic roots. Well, that's not true. Abraham's son Ishmael. If you know the history of Arabs, they claim their descendants from Ishmael. And Ishmael himself, Abraham and Ishmael, they built the Kaaba and they ran around it, and et cetera, et cetera. And the Arabs did have that same religion of Abraham, but again, paganistic ideologies did creep in, and when Islam came, it eradicated that. Paul clearly says that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, because flesh and blood is mortal, perishable body. We are resurrected in an imperishable body. So Paul, again, I don't see any good evidence for physical resurrection. If you read Philippians 3, the entire Philippians 3 in Paul, this entire chapter is crushed with spurned the flesh and glorified the spirit theme. Paul has no confidence in flesh anymore. Philippians chapter 3, verse number 3. So this is clear. This is good evidence that Paul was teaching a spiritual resurrection. And this answers the common objection that a Pharisee would have not believed into a spiritual resurrection, since the Talmud and the Mishnah tell only the rising of corpse. Again, Paul flatly rejected the Pharisee doctrine.
That's fine.
Okay.
All right, Ehteshaam just said, go to Philippians 3 if you want to see that the Apostle Paul did not support bodily resurrection. I said that Paul says things like this all over the place, but let's go to the chapter that Ehteshaam says we should go to. Philippians 3:21. I'll start at 20. For our citizenship is in heaven, from which we eagerly wait for a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform the body of our humble state, that's our body now, who will transform, not get rid of, not replace, who will transform the body of our humble state into conformity with the body of his glory by the exertion of the power that he has to subject all things to himself. Once again, in the very sources that Ehteshaam appeals to, we find the exact opposite of what he is saying. Paul believed in the resurrection of the body. He states it there. He states it in 1 Corinthians 15, which Ehteshaam also appeals to. Again, if you're just going to reject every clear statement that opposes your view, I don't know what to do in a debate. He said the Jewish and Christian sources weren't circulating in Arabia. I don't know what scholars he's referring to. The Jews were all over the place. The Jews were in Medina when Muhammad went there. They had the Talmud. We find these stories in the Quran. Actual scholars who investigate this know that Muhammad was influenced by these sources. So how can you say these and again, as I pointed out, the Muslims were saying the same things that we find in the Gnostic and Josephus texts. So how were these not influenced? He says, well, the Muslim practices weren't influenced by paganism because Abraham did it. This is a debate. We're going with historical evidence. The only people prior to Muhammad who performed all these practices were the pagans. So all the evidence we have tells us that these practices were influenced by the pagans, kissing the black stone, circling the Kaaba, all 5 of the prayer times that Muslims have. The Sabaeans prayed at those times. I don't think this is a tremendous problem for this debate, but since he is rejecting pagan sources, you have to reject Muhammad's view on Jesus.
Sean, this is your last.
Just getting to pre-Islamic sources on Christianity, on Islam in Arabia. If you read Richard Bell's book, The Origin of Islam in its Christian Environment, on page 42, he clearly states there were no seats of Christianity in Arabia. So how no seats of Christianity in Makkah, Medina, or in the Hijaz area, the Western Arabia, where Prophet Muhammad was. So how can Prophet Muhammad get these sources? I mean, Richard Bell, which is a textbook. I mean, this guy was a historian. He knew his stuff. He clearly states on page 42 there were no seats of Christianity in the area where Prophet Muhammad was. And historians themselves agree that there were no Bibles, etc., etc. Again, what Mr. Wood isn't telling you is that nowhere in any of Paul's epistles does he talk about, the resurrection or any empty tombs, any appearances in the flesh, etc., etc. Paul did not believe in that. He was clearly preaching some kind of spiritual resurrection. In Galatians 1, he says that I had a revelation from God, and this rules out any flesh encounters. In the gospel accounts, no one sees Jesus rise from the dead. They only observe a missing body and are later visited. And we can't. It's hard to check the empty tomb in the first place because Jerusalem was completely sacked and destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. So any white lies about Jesus physically rising from his tomb could never be checked against the facts against the time. We have no account in the letters of Paul or Peter that anyone cared to check them before that time, nor in the letters of James, Jude, or John, although their authenticity also has been questioned by scholars.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, so far we've had a very interesting debate today. It's been electrifying on both sides. David has provided his case, and Ehteshaam has provided excellent counter rebuttals, and we've seen the focus has been on a various range of topics, going from the nature of the resurrection, according to Paul, all the way to pagan rituals and pagan stories about dying and rising gods. It's been all over the board today, and it's been very interesting. We're now going to hear the conclusion, 5-minute conclusion from David, followed by a 5-minute conclusion from Ehteshaam right before the question and answer session. David, you have a 5-minute conclusion.
As I said in my opening statement, history is a huge problem for Islam. I said that I would prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Jesus died by crucifixion. Has Ehteshaam given us a reasonable doubt? Is it reasonable for Muslims to say, yes, all of the earliest sources agree that Jesus died by crucifixion, yes, all of the evidence tells us that Jesus died by crucifixion, and yes, virtually all experts in this field agree that Jesus died by crucifixion, but we can go to the Bible and rip a bunch of verses out of context, mangle them, ignore everything that comes around them, and pretend that the Bible supports the Quran. So the Muslim view is correct. Is this reasonable? Of course not. That's an unreasonable doubt. Again, using this sort of thinking, you could doubt anything. You could doubt that I'm standing here right now. In this debate, Ehteshaam has argued that people believe the pagan myth theory. People believe that it crucified Inanna. Again, I object to even calling this a crucifixion. The person was hung on a hook. Is this a parallel? No, none of these are parallels. He says that it's not possible to die in just a few hours. Again, we've seen that people died from the scourging itself and afterwards as well. He says, he keeps referring to Paul, saying that Paul had a spiritual view of resurrection. Again, yes, but if by spiritual you think that has nothing to do with the body, this is completely false. I have quoted several passages from Paul, from the very chapters he's appealing to, showing where Paul clearly says that the body will be raised. He appealed to the sign of Jonah. Again, the context of the sign of Jonah, we have countless references from Jesus himself saying that he's going to go up to Jerusalem, die, be crucified, be killed, and rise from the dead. We have these over and over and over again. That's the context of the sign of Jonah. And besides that, he didn't respond to any of the other things I pointed out about the sign of Jonah. For instance, that the phrase Jonah uses refers to Sheol. He says that there were no seats of, on the issue of consistency, when I pointed out that we would have to reject his view based on the criteria he's using, he says that there were no seats of Christianity. Well, if by seats you mean large communities, that's true, but Arabia was filled with heretics, Christian heretics. They were fleeing the Roman Empire from persecution, and they went to Arabia. And we know, because from the Muslim sources, Muhammad talked to all kinds of these people. Read the Hadith, read the Quran. Muhammad knew these people. He says that Muhammad didn't have a Torah. Well, that's interesting. In Sunan Abu Dawud, number 4434, Muhammad put a hand on a copy of the Torah and swore that it's the word of God. This is quite odd if Muhammad never had access to any of these Jewish and Christian sources. He says that no one sees Jesus rise from the dead. True, but they knew that he was dead. This was witnessed by practically everyone in Jerusalem. They knew that he was dead. And then if they see him walking around again later, and he's not hobbling along and crawling, then it's obvious that he's risen from the dead. he says that the Gospels are not reliable. He actually asked me to name a scholar who says that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies. The main authority in the world on this is Burridge. He says that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biography. You could also go to Ben Witherington, Darrell Bach. This is the main view. And we can compare our views in terms of theology, methodology, and evidence. Theologically, think about what his view suggests. If Ehteshaam's view is right, everyone in the first century that we have any record of completely misinterpreted what happened. Everyone was convinced that Jesus died on the cross. Christians, Jews, and Romans. And yet God did nothing to correct this false view. Ehteshaam says that Jesus appeared to the disciples and tried to show them that he was alive, but they just didn't get the point. Well, he could have said, hey, by the way, I survived, I didn't die. So Jesus, according to Ehteshaam's view, must have been the absolute worst communicator in history. He's trying to tell people, I'm not going to die when we go up to Jerusalem. But when it comes out, he says, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. He appears to his followers, and he wants to tell them that he survived crucifixion, but he just can't get the point across, and they go to their horribly bloody deaths proclaiming his resurrection. Jesus was an awful communicator, according to his view. And God just never corrected this. Theologically, his position was filled with problems. Methodologically, ripping verses out of context, going against all scholars. This is a problem with methodology. My view, I'm consistent. Whether I'm investigating Islam, whether I'm investigating Christianity, I go to the earliest sources, base my views on those sources. And finally, as far as evidence is concerned, all scholars agree with who? My view. All sources agree with who? My view. What do we have that supports the Muslim view? We don't have anything that supports the Muslim view for centuries and centuries and centuries. So why are we even having this debate? We're having this debate because Muhammad, in Surah 4:157, said that Jesus never died. There's no evidence for that position.
Thank you, David. Now we have our conclusion from Ehteshaam Gulam. Ehteshaam?
In closing, so the only way Jesus could have fulfilled the sign of Jonah is if he survived the crucifixion, which all the Gospels say he did. Jesus never says that I've been resurrected. He comes back. All the angels, Mary Magdalene, they say he's alive. Nowhere in any of the Gospels, So in conclusion, Jesus was put on the cross, however, he didn't die on the cross. Rather, he survived. This is a more naturalistic possibility. People have survived far worse, and Jesus survived the torture and scourging that he already went through. So I strongly believe that Jesus was resuscitated and not resurrected. The story of Jesus coming and dying for our sins just doesn't make any sense, because why would a God of the entire universe want to save humanity, who would send his message of salvation only to a select few people once 2,000 years ago? Why not just appear to everyone on earth? There is not a single historical document which proves Jesus' resurrection. There were 60 historians in the Roman world, yet only Josephus and Tacitus mentioned Jesus' crucifixion. But again, these have been proven to be forgeries and unreliable. So a careful reading of the New Testament clearly proves that Jesus survived his ordeal. I think that's a more naturalistic possibility. Again, we have Venturi, who also agrees with this. And before I completely conclude, I just want to make a comment about the Christianity and Judaism in Islam. It's not possible that Prophet Muhammad was influenced by all these, because he was illiterate, and I don't know what hadith he's referring to about the Torah. Almost all scholars agree that the Arabic translations of the Torah in the New Testament were after the birth of Islam. Arabia was illiterate. There were no libraries in pre-Islamic Arabia, etc., etc. There is absolutely no way that Prophet Muhammad got his information from the Bible. I mean, even James White, who's a scholar in Christian studies and New Testament, etc., even agrees that there were no Bibles in Arabia. I mean, no historian says that. Again, read Richard Bell's book of The Origin of Islam in Its Christian Environment, page 42. He clearly says no seeds of Christianity. So it's not possible that Prophet Muhammad got his ideas the Bible. So in conclusion, I would like to thank Mr. Wood for coming all the way from New York to participate in this debate. I don't know any Christian who is willing to travel that far for a debate. So thank you, Mr. Wood, for this opportunity. I'd also like to thank Mr. Saeed from the Arabic Christian Perspective for organizing this debate, Mr. Qureshi for announcing this on Answering Muslims website, and finally you for attending. You can read my book, From Christianity to Islam, The Truth You Need to Know, coming out next year. And you can also read my essays and articles on my thoughts on Christianity and Islam on my website, www.answering-christianclaims.com. Or if you're interested in other thoughts on Christianity and Islam from Muslims, you can go to calltomonotheism.com or examinethetruth.com, run by my friend Nader Ahmed. Thank you again.
Thank you for that, and again, just to reiterate, the websites for these two debaters, respectively, for David, www.act17.net, and he has a blog site, www.answeringmuslims.com, and for Ehteshaam Gulam, www.answering-christian-claims.com. We're now going to move on to the question and answer session. I've already received all the questions from the audience. I have the first one in my hand. The way this is going to work is each person to whom the question is addressed will receive 2 minutes to answer the question, and the other person will receive 1 minute to comment on the person's answer. Do we understand that? So the first question is actually addressed to both, so you each have 2 minutes. The question is, what does the Quran mean when Jesus said, "Blessed was the day I was born, blessed is the day that I die, and blessed is the day that I am resurrected"? Since this is talking about the Quran, we're going to start, I guess, with the Muslim speaker. But both speakers have 2 minutes. Ehteshaam? Yeah.
The question, that's a good question. It's referring to sometime in the future. It could be a flash forward or something like that. The Quran clearly states that they did not kill him or crucify him. What I understand is that Jesus was put on the cross, but he survived the cross. So this is some kind of a flash forward. In his second coming, Jesus will come and he will die natural death. Thank you.
I think this is an awesome question based on methodology here. The Quran declares, Jesus said, that he's going to die and that he's going to rise. If we just read that verse, we would conclude this refers to Jesus' death and resurrection, the same thing we find in Christianity. When we read it in the context of what the rest of the Quran says, we find another verse saying that Jesus never died. So how do we interpret this? Well, some interpreters do claim that this can only refer to that present life of Jesus, and therefore that verse is saying he was going to die. But I'm inclined to say, no, let's look for the view that makes these passages consistent with what the rest of the Quran says. So, I would agree. If you're a Muslim, you should believe that when it says Jesus is going to die, this must refer to some time after his second coming, based on consistency. Now, are Muslims consistent when they do the reverse? No, we've seen over and over again pulling verses out of the New Testament and completely ignoring every passage where the New Testament says exactly the opposite. We saw this with the crucifixion. Pull out the sign of Jonah. This must mean that Jesus isn't going to die. Well, what does every other statement by Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew say? I'm going up to Jerusalem, I'm going to die. I'm going up to Jerusalem, I'm going to die. I'm going up to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, and then I'm going to rise from the dead. Do Muslims interpret that consistently? Do they look to the other verses to see what do the verses say, and let's make this consistent? No. So when Muslims go to the Bible, they make no attempts to harmonize passages, to harmonize their interpretations with everything that said. We saw the same thing in the Apostle Paul, pulling verses out of the context, even though the following verses refute the view. I've said from the beginning that I am consistent, and so I go with the Muslim view on the Quran, that Jesus was not killed.
The next question is for David. David received 2 minutes, and Ehteshaam 1 minute for comment. Christians believe that Jesus died for their sins. Is that fair for someone to die for someone else's sin? Why wouldn't God just forgive people?
Well, that's an excellent question, and Ehteshaam has apparently challenged this in the course of this debate. I'm a philosopher, so whenever I'm thinking in these terms, I'm thinking of philosophically what is the concept of God. According to Christians and general theists, God is infinite in his attributes. If God has an attribute, it's going to be infinite. So if God is powerful, he's all-powerful. If he's knowing, he's all-knowing. But it's the same with other attributes, such as God's justice and his mercy. If God is just, he's all just. What does it mean for someone to be all just? Well, if you just sweep sins under the rug when people commit them, if you say, you did this, but I'm just going to let that slide, you can say that's nice. You can't say that's infinitely just. So an infinitely just being is going to punish all sin. At the same time, we believe that God is loving and merciful, which would mean that he's all loving and merciful. If we ask what that sort of being would do, well, that sort of being would do anything to forgive people. Even be willing to come into his own creation and lay down the price for their sins. So in Christianity, we find these attributes that seem to be opposed to one another, and we see how these attributes meet at the cross. At the cross, all sin is punished, and at the cross, God exhibits his love for everyone who will believe in this message. Now, is this fair? Well, if you say it's not, come, please, explain to me a different way where God's attributes of infinite justice and infinite love can be satisfied. If you don't have something like the cross, you have to say that God's just going to send everyone to hell. That would be infinite justice, not infinitely loving. Or you can say God's just going to forgive everyone. That's very loving and nice. That's not infinite justice. So the only way to reconcile the attributes of God, if sinners are involved, is for something like the crucifixion, sacrificial death of Jesus Christ. So I think that this makes perfect sense.
Just quickly, die doesn't mean death in the New Testament. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that I die daily, so that doesn't mean he dies daily, he's resurrected. It means that he's suffering. The problem I have with Christianity is what happens to the people before Jesus. If you say, well, Jesus came and died for his sins, well, what about the people before Jesus? That's not really fair to them. Another problem is that nowhere in Jesus in the Gospel of John, chapter 17, verse 3 says, I have completed the work you've given me to do. Therefore, what? Okay. Therefore, I'm done with this work. So nowhere in the Gospels does Jesus say, "I come to atone for the sins." Rather, Islam teaches that life is a test, a trial, a challenge, an opportunity. It's not some kind of punishment you need to be saved from. And this makes a lot more sense than Christianity's view that life is a punishment. Well, what about the people before Jesus? And if Jesus really died for our sins, why can't we sin? Why can't we, rob, steal, rape, etc., etc.? It just doesn't make any sense to me. Thank you.
The next question is addressed to Ehteshaam. How can you support that there is 100% no way a man can die, no matter how close to death he already is, in 3 hours? You said there is no way. How is that true?
The reason why I said that is because death by crucifixion typically took days. If someone's on the cross for 3 hours, it's hard for me to believe that they died. Another thing I want to say is that the spearing story is probably false. Early church fathers thought of it symbolically, and I didn't bring this up in my opening statement. A person 3 hours on the cross, it's not possible that he can die. Death by crucifixion typically took days. It did not take hours. Therefore, I believe it's very likely that Jesus survived because of that thing.
Well, he again says that death typically would have taken days. It certainly could take days. But as I pointed out repeatedly, if you wanted to be more merciful to someone, you would give them a heavier beating so that they would die more quickly. In addition to this, Pilate wanted to beat Jesus so bad that the Jews would drop their claim against him. We can assume that he would have had him beaten very severely if he wanted Jesus to survive. So these would point to a more severe beating, and this would be perfectly consistent with the claim that Jesus died within the space of several hours. He says that the spear story is probably false. Based on everything we know about Roman crucifixion, the Romans ended crucifixion with a death blow. So if you want to say spear thrust was a myth, great, they would have done something else. Again, this involved crushing the head, spear through the heart, letting wild animals rip the body alive, or setting it on fire. So one of those was done to Jesus, and all of those would kill him.
This next question is for David. If Christians believe Jesus died on the cross, does that mean they can go out and drink and commit all types of sins?
I'm sorry, I was going to read some passages, but my time is short. Maybe I'll pull a few out. In the New Testament, Jesus dies for our sins. What do we see in the book of John? What do we see in the book of 1 John? What do we see in the book of Romans? What do we see Christian writers say? They say that if you think you can just go out and sin based on Jesus' sacrifice for you, you're not even a Christian. By this is in 1 John, by this we know that we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments. The one who says, I have come to know him, and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him is the love of God, in him the love of God has truly been perfected. So according to the Bible, if you go out and say, Jesus died for my sins, therefore I can go around sinning all I want, you are not even a Christian. Why? Because if you really give your life to Jesus Christ, you are empowered by the Spirit. And if you are empowered by the Spirit of God, you are not going to go around living any sort of sinful life that you want to. We see the same thing in the writings of Paul. Shall we continue to sin so that grace may increase? By no means. Paul declares the same thing. You can't do this as a Christian. And so the idea that we can go on sinning as much as we want because Jesus died for our sins, anyone who really cares about Jesus at all will not do that.
Well, there's several problems with that. If you read the Gospels, if you read the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5, verse number 17 through 18, Jesus clearly says, I've not come to abolish the law, I've come to fulfill the law. And further on in Matthew 19, he says that obey the commandments. Yet Paul is coming and saying, he's nailing the commandments to the cross. So who do we follow? Do we follow Jesus or do we follow Paul? There's obviously a contradiction here. And if Jesus really did die for sins, then why can't we do sins? I mean, it just doesn't. That means Jesus didn't die for everybody's sins. It's like going to a restaurant and somebody pays for your bill and then they say you can eat anything but you can't eat chicken. It just doesn't make it. It just doesn't make that much sense to me.
I've never heard that one before. Eat anything but can't eat chicken. I'll have to remember that one. Okay, Ehteshaam, you have another question. You say there were no Christian sources, like Bibles, in Arabia, but the Sahih Hadith say that Muhammad's cousin Ibn Waraka was a Christian scholar who translated parts of the Bible. Your explanation?
There were some Christians in Arabia, but the problem with this theory of Prophet Muhammad learning from Ibn Waraka was very weak. The reason why is because Ibn Waraka died at least shortly after Prophet Muhammad received his revelations. Again, I highly encourage everybody to read Richard Bell's book, The Origin of Islam in its Christian Environment. Go to page 42. He clearly states there are no seats of Christianity in the area which Prophet Muhammad was in. And a lot of scholars agreed that there were no seats, there were no Christianity, there was no Christianity or Bibles or churches or anything like that. If you read the New Catholic Encyclopedia, again, it also says that there was the Christian church was not found in Arabia. There's absolutely no way Prophet Muhammad got his ideas from the Bible or anything like that.
My computer's going too slow now, but I was going to read for you a ton of verses directly from the Quran where Muhammad was accused over and over and over again of getting his stories from other people. I've said every time he would go up and deliver a surah, they would say, these are but tales of the ancients. He heard this from someone else. We find this over and over and over again in the Quran. These were the people who were there, who knew what stories were circulating at his time, and these were the people who said, hey, this story he's giving us, that guy down the street is saying the exact same thing. This comes from the Quran itself. So how can you say, there's no way Muhammad was influenced? These stories weren't around him. And yet the Quran declares that the people who were listening to him were saying repeatedly, you got things from the guys down the street. Ehteshaam's view makes no sense in light of what the Quran says, in light of what the Hadith says, in light of what we know about the status of heretical Christians and Jews during the time of Muhammad.
I keep telling David to get him back. He won't have any problems. Anyhow, David, your next question. Why was the Bible changed from the original form? The original Bible never said that Jesus died on the cross.
What Bible would this be? I've never seen this Bible. I've never seen any scholar who says that there was such a Bible. We have over 5,500, over 5,700 now manuscripts in Greek. Many more manuscripts in other languages, Latin. Where exactly is the New Testament that doesn't have Jesus' death, deity, and resurrection? We don't exist. And this is interesting because, as Ehteshaam has pointed out, there were all kinds of heretical groups that started up from the 2nd century onward. There were all kinds of groups who had a diversity of beliefs. There were people who said Jesus was only human and he wasn't divine. There were groups that said Jesus was only divine and he wasn't human. There were all kinds. 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and 5th centuries, Christians had no centralized authority under the Roman Empire. They were in trouble. They couldn't go out and crack down on people with heretical beliefs. So there were all these groups with all their books, and yet when we go to the 1st century text, when we go to all the texts that survive from the 1st century, what do we find? Jesus' death, his resurrection, and his deity consistently throughout all of these books. So there was ample opportunity for any books suggesting anything else, giving any other view. There was ample opportunity for these books to survive, and we have books from the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century that give other views. But when we go back to the position of the original followers of Jesus, and to Paul, and to the people who came afterwards, we find a consistent emphasis on Jesus' death, resurrection, and deity, and these are the core elements of the Christian gospel.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know of any Bible that's been changed. But the problem with the Gospels is that they were written later. They were written after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. And that's a long time. That's at least 40 years after the event. And they were based on unreliable oral traditions, etc., etc. And they were written by anonymous Greek authors. And Jesus never spoke Greek. He spoke Aramaic. The problem here is Paul never mentions any physical resurrection. We have no records of that. And the disciples, again, were not eyewitnesses to the event. So I strongly believe Jesus survived and then came back. There's just no evidence for a physical resurrection. If you read old Paul, he never talks about Jesus being risen in the flesh. Therefore, he's talking about something spiritual. And the Gospels are saying he came back physical. Therefore, he survived. That's the only possible explanation.
Ehteshaam, this next question is for you. Is it possible that the Dajjal being a Muslim term for Antichrist or something similar, is it possible that the Dajjal, in his role as a deceiver/destroyer, has sought to use subterfuge and denial as major blindfolds to clearly understanding what the Bible consistently declares in order to destroy hope and salvation from the wrath coming against the wicked? It's a long question. I'll leave it up here for you to read it.
Wow, this is a long question.
Well, Dajjal doesn't necessarily have to be, a person. It could be like a government, or that's what some people say. To destroy hope and so I don't understand the question. Muslims do believe in the Antichrist. However, it's possible it could be a government, or it doesn't necessarily have to be a person. Salvation in the Bible clearly, Jesus clearly talks about keeping the law and commandments. Yet Paul is saying something completely different. I do not know how to answer this question. But quickly going on to salvation, Islam is more consistent with the view of Jesus, that Jesus clearly says, obey the commandments in Matthew 19, and not come to fulfill the law in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 through 18. So Jesus is clearly talking about keeping the law and commandments. That's how you gain salvation. Paul is saying something completely different. Dajjal will come in the future. I'm sorry, I do not understand the question. I apologize for that. But the Antichrist is accepted in Islam, and Muslims do believe that he will come as major blind spots to clarify understanding what the blind was. Okay, I apologize. This is oddly worded. If you want to talk to me privately, you can do so.
David, do you want to address the question?
I'm not sure I understood it completely either. Based on what it sounded like, if Muslims believe in the Antichrist, could the Antichrist be someone who corrupted the gospel to keep people from knowing the Christian gospel? I would say yes. When we go to our historical records, we find the consistent Christian gospel was Jesus' death, resurrection, and deity. These were the three core elements of the Christian gospel. We're also told that false prophets were going to come and corrupt this gospel. So it makes sense, if someone is going to come and corrupt this message, that this could be a deceiving spirit. What do we find in Islam? Muslims say, yes, we agree with you on practically everything. We agree with the existence of God. We agree that Jesus was the Messiah. We agree that he performed miracles. We agree that he was born of the Virgin. We agree with almost everything except he didn't die on the cross, he didn't rise from the dead, he never claimed to be divine. Throw out those three things and we're in perfect agreement. Well, this is exactly the sort of thing we would expect from someone being influenced by some sort of evil spirit against the gospel.
And if you have questions for the speakers, again, we finished collecting the ones that we're going to discuss here, but feel free to stop and ask and clarify the questions after the question and answer session is over. This last question for you, David. Why would an all-powerful God send his message of salvation to a secret group of people 2,000 years ago? Why not just to everyone? Or why not offer salvation to everyone?
Well, Christians believe that God does offer salvation to everyone. If by everyone you mean that all at once God just gives his message to the entire world, this is something that Christians and Muslims would have to deal with, because according to Islam, God didn't do this either. So we're sort of in the same boat as far as why didn't God just give a message to everyone at the same time, write it on the moon perhaps, so that everyone can see it. For me, it seems that mankind sinned and rebelled against God. And for that, it seems that we should be involved in going out and proclaiming the message. It seems that we should have something to do with the spread of the message that redeems people. But as far as coming at the time when Jesus did, that was the perfect time in history. Alexander the Great had spread the Greek language across a couple of continents. Almost anywhere you can go, you can find people to speak in Greek. The Romans had paved roads all across the Roman Empire, so anywhere you wanted to go, you could get very quickly. If the message was going to spread, up until that point, that was the perfect time in all of history to spread a message very rapidly. This is when Jesus comes onto the scene. This is when we find the Christian gospel. And so when the Christian gospel spread, correct me, I don't know, you can disagree with me, but I even see the divine hand of God in the way and in the manner that this message spread. And despite the persecution, despite everything, the Jews, the Romans, everyone trying to stop it, it spread too fast. And so, yes, we are stuck with deep theological problems as far as why did God do this rather than this. But as far as the spread of Christianity, this does seem to be a perfect time in history to do so.
Actually, there are problems here because, again, what about the people before Jesus? You know, David never answered that. The people before Jesus, did they get screwed over, or did they get salvation? Why would God send His message of salvation to a secret group of people in Palestine 2,000 years ago? Why couldn't Jesus just appear to everybody? And that would strengthen the credibility of the gospel. But instead, He appears, secretly, and he doesn't go around to people, let's say China or India or South America, etc. He just stays in Palestine. I find that kind of odd. Again, life to me is a test, a trial, a challenge, an opportunity. It's not some kind of punishment you need to be saved from. I think this makes a lot more sense. And the Jews also believe that life is a challenge, it's an opportunity. And this makes more sense. It's some kind of punishment you need to be saved from. Thank you.
And this is the final question of the evening for you, Ehteshaam. If you say that Jesus rose as a spirit, then you are agreeing that Jesus died, which contradicts the teaching of the Quran, which says they killed him not, nor crucified him.
Well, I quoted 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18, and again, Peter was not an eyewitness to the events. So, scholars agree that Peter did not write 1 Peter. It's most likely a fabrication. Peter was a fisherman, an uneducated fisherman, and yet he's writing this highly well-written Greek text. I just don't find that possible. So again, the disciples were not eyewitnesses to what they were saying. So whoever wrote 1 Peter probably got it from hearsay. That's all we have. I mean, Paul was writing 20 years after the event. He was not an eyewitness to the event of Jesus' life. Therefore, I can't really take it to be a historical backing for anything he said for anything he says about the crucifixion. And yeah, that's it.
I think the question was about Ehteshaam's view of the spiritual resurrection. If Jesus was going around as a spirit, then he must have died. I don't know if Ehteshaam was consistent throughout the debate, but it seems he's saying that Jesus wasn't killed, that he was crucified and came back. As I pointed out, it would be impossible for anyone to conclude that he had risen in any sense if he came in crawling on all fours in this state. No one would have ever concluded that he had risen, let alone that he was resurrected. The fact that people concluded resurrection shows that something happened that baffled the mind. It says the disciples weren't eyewitnesses. They knew he died. They knew he was appearing to them. That's where their belief in Jesus' resurrection comes from. Just to close out, he said, what happened if he died before the gospel came along? Well, people were judged based on the revelation that God had given them, and Christianity would believe in a natural revelation as well. Just by pondering the cosmos, we can know that there's a God, we can know that there's a moral law, that we have violated that moral law, and so we can turn to God in repentance, and I would invite everyone to do just that.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give our debaters a hand for this. Thank you, David and Ehteshaam, for this debate. I found it very lively. Again, you can go to their websites to get more information, www.accessofteen.net and www.answering-christian-claims.com. Thank you for coming out this evening.